So today we're going to talk about designing with perennials, and right now it's just early spring here, late April, and the perennials are just starting to arrive. So we need to know how to put them into our garden in a pleasing way. And so before we begin, just want to kind of give a definition to perennial. A lot of people get mixed up between annual and perennial. Annuals are the ones you have to plant every year. Perennials are what they call herbaceous plants. They'll die down to the ground in the winter, but then new life will come up from the root system in the spring. So they return year after year on their own. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And there's a lot of benefits to perennial gardening. And whether you're an experienced gardener or just getting started, perennials can be an easy way to get started and can be adapted to suit your needs and your budget. So you can start with whatever scale you wish with them. And no matter what your gardening situation is, whether you have full sun, whether you have shades, whether you have a wet spot, whether you have really dry conditions, the perennials can meet those criteria as well. And there's a vast number of perennials, a lot of our native varieties and that will attract songbirds, butterflies, bees and that pollinators to your garden. And so that's a great way of attracting the wildlife. And also provides you with year-round interest. Even though the perennials die down, sometimes we're left with real interesting seed heads. Some like the coneflowers and rudbeckia, the sedums and that have the pink broccoli flower heads on in the fall. They can be all attractive in the garden for the winter and at least add some texture. And there's a whole family of ornamental grasses that too just add that winter interest. So even though most of them are dying down and you think of them as only 3 seasons, we can actually get 4 seasons out of them. I love to leave the perennials up in my garden in the winter, whatever's still looking good. Any interesting seed heads, coneflowers are attracting goldfinches during the winter. The sedums, just with a little pocket of snow sitting on the flower heads, it can also be a real interest in the garden. So don't just stop thinking about them as nothing there for the winter time, but there is ones that can offer you some winter interest. And regardless of your style, whether you have Japanese style, cottage style, very contemporary, you can still get perennials to fit into that. We often think of perennials being a bit more country or cottagey looking. But if you're doing like layers of ornamental grasses and that, you can still get a real contemporary look to it. So no matter what your gardening style is, you can get perennials that will suit that. Succulent gardens and that have become very popular, and there's a number of perennials like the hens and chicks that you can be doing a kind of succulent look, but something that's going to return year after year, whether in containers or in the ground. So with perennials, really the only limitation is your imagination. You can almost do anything with them. But just a few facts about perennial gardens. I've always, as a designer, I get a lot of people saying, oh, I want a very low maintenance garden, so give me all perennials. And that's a bit of a myth. Any garden is going to take some work. It's true that a lot of perennials don't need a lot of care, but you have to remember that they might need deadheading. You'll have to watch for insects and diseases. A lot of perennials, say every 4 or 5 years, need dividing. So there is some care to them, but it doesn't mean that has to be overwhelming. So again, your choice of what perennials you choose in that will kind of dictate how much maintenance you have. But all perennial gardens do take a little bit of work. And another fact is that perennial gardens are never finished, especially if you're a true gardener. You're always moving them. And when we put shrubs into the garden, usually they're there to stay, and we don't move them around too much. But perennials with a very small root system, they're very easy to dig up and move around. So I find you're never done. If you're talking to a true gardener, they'll always say, oh, I just found this plant. If I move this one, I can put that one in its spot. And we're always looking for that perfect combination where we've got the color and we've got different bloom times and different times of interest. And so if you're a perennial gardener, you probably know you're never done in your garden, which is a great thing. And perennials are movable. As we just said, it's easy to dig up. So if you're not liking a combination, or you do find that little treasure at the garden center that you just have to find a spot for, perennials are very movable. So you're not just caught once you planted it, you don't have to put up with it for 20 years. You can keep moving them around at the appropriate times and still enjoy your garden. So just a few facts about perennial gardens. Over the years, perennial garden has really changed. Back at the beginning of the last century, a lot of you probably have heard of Gertrude Jekyll, which is one of the main designers at that time with perennials. And she kind of created that classic perennial border where you have the big hedge at the back, then you have a deep perennial border with the tall perennials at the back, and then going down to shorter ones at the front, usually a pathway across the front. And that's kind of that typical English perennial garden is what kind of started it off. But it wasn't until into the 1950s and that we started using perennials differently. There was a fellow English plantsman called, his name is Alan Bloom, and he kind of created the island garden, putting the tallest perennials in the center and working down on all sides. But now we seem to be using perennials just integrated in with our regular gardens. So a lot of designing I do, I have evergreens, flowering shrubs, and perennials all in the same border. And gardening has, with perennials has really changed over the last couple of years even. Some people are just doing the straight, very contemporary straight rows of grass and then maybe a sedum and that. So we really are experimenting with new styles of perennial gardening. So if you have that thought that perennials is just a English cottage look, there's many different looks that you can create with the perennials. So it's great to see the changing of times and then how perennials have adapted to that. So we want to look at some steps to planning your perennial garden. And why look at designing perennials? A lot of people will just start putting perennials in the ground, and when they're done, I find a lot of people are just not happy with the way it looks. And that's why a design or some thinking behind it really pays off. We can buy all the plants that we love to have in our garden, but it's still not be right when we're finished. So planning a perennial garden, it is important to consider these following steps and make sure that you're getting all that interest in that possible. So there's about 3 or 4 steps we'd like to go through today. And one is analyzing your site. Before you get started, you really need to know how much sunlight you're getting in a garden. Is it getting morning sun, afternoon sun? Usually what's on the labels when you're shopping for perennials, you'll see that this sun or part shade and shade. So full sun, we talk about 5-6 hours of sunlight, and that would be considered sun. So whether it's in the morning, whether you're getting that in the afternoon, they find that a plant really doesn't benefit from additional sunlight. They kind of take up their full amount that they need in that 5-6 hours. So full sun would be 6 hours or more of sun. Part shade or part sun, kind of the same idea. It would be more around that 4 or 5 hours of sunlight. And it also depends on what time of day that area is getting the sun. If all you're getting is early morning sun and then shading for the afternoon, the sun in the morning isn't as strong or isn't as hot. So that would be considered more of a shade if you're getting afternoon shade, morning sun in that area. So also look at what time of day it's getting that light. Shade is anything less than 3 hours of sunlight. So in perennials, you might be looking more at ferns and hostas and that sort of thing. But there is quite a selection of perennials, regardless of what your sunlight is getting. Another thing to consider when you're analyzing your site is just your view lines. Where are you viewing this garden from? Maybe it's from when you're sitting on the patio, it's right beside the patio and you're viewing it up close. Maybe it's way in the back corner if you've got half an acre or something. And the principles of design slightly different. We'll talk about that as well. So where are you viewing it from? Where do you need the interest? Where do you need the color? And so that's important to consider when you're analyzing your site. Also, when you're analyzing your site, look for the existing features you have to work around. Maybe there's a large maple tree there and you know it's very dry underneath there and hard to get the shovel into the ground. So you'll need to know what those existing features are and how it affects the sunlight and that sort of thing as well. But just look at the features you have to work with and your growing conditions. Do you have really sandy soil that drains very quickly? Do you have a heavy clay soil that the water sits there longer? Are you getting a lot of wind in that area that you have to be careful on what you plant because the wind will just snap the delphiniums apart or that. So what kind of growing conditions do you have there? And also just what zone you live in. Here in Niagara, most of us are zone 6. If you go up the escarpment a bit more from Niagara Lake, you're getting into zone 5. And what they've done is, for all plants, is given them zone numbers. The lower the number is, the colder winter temperature it can tolerate. So if you're thinking of Timmins, there is zone 2. If you're going down to Florida, there is zone 8, 9. So all the plants come with tags in them that has their zoning. So if you see a zone 6 or lower number, it will survive here in Niagara. If you're in the Toronto area, and that's usually you're getting a London area, you're more zone 5. Going into Muskokas, you're getting into zone 4. So you want to make sure the zone number is at least your number or lower than your number. So knowing your zone is also an important part of analyzing your site. Another important consideration when you're designing a perennial garden is your style. And as I said earlier, the perennials can kind of fit your style. Whether you're more contemporary and doing more lineal, straight line plantings and that sort of thing, doing more mass plantings. Whether you're more English cottage, or even a Japanese style garden can have a lot of grasses and ferns and succulents in it and still pull off for a Japanese garden. Usually for a Japanese garden you have less flowers and it concentrates more on the foliage. So whatever your style is, but it's best if it reflects the rest of your garden as well. Or maybe you've set up a certain little garden area where you're having a special style. But consider that before you start choosing your perennials. If you're doing more contemporary but you have a lot of large daisy flowers, it's probably not going to be the best combination. So it's something you want to think about. Even go online, kind of Google Japanese garden or English cottage garden, and just see what kind of pictures are there and get a good idea of what plants will suit that. If you're going more country, it's usually a lot more daisies and delphiniums, liatris, some of the older fashioned flowers, bigger flowers and that sort of thing. The contemporary, they can be just some large flowers in with a lot of foliage color. So considering your style is still very important when you're designing a perennial garden. So if we were going to consider doing a Japanese garden, you'll see in this picture that's up on the screen that what we've done is usually just some main plants. So we've added in a lantern, we've added in a Japanese maple. But a lot of what's around there is like low mosses, plants that are more there for different textures than what they are there for the flower. You can still introduce a bit of flowers into a Japanese garden, more your whites and soft yellows and that. You usually don't want too much vibrant pinks in that going into a Japanese garden. So it's more looking at the leaf, the texture, whether it's something like lamb's ear that has a fuzzy leaf, or coreopsis that has that very fine leaf to it. But it can still be used in that. But get some main elements that tell you it's a Japanese style, like a lantern, Japanese maple, maybe it's a Buddha sitting on a rock, and those will help convey that message across. If you're designing a contemporary garden, a lot of contemporary gardens are very simple lines. You're not doing 3 of this, 1 of this, getting it too busy looking, but you just want it very simple. And it's usually going more linear. Usually contemporary beds, they're more geometric shaped, and so you just want to follow the plant material, follow the line of the bed. So maybe you have some taller grasses in the background for your heights. Maybe you're going down into some sedums, or that has a nice light green leaf with pink broccoli heads on it. Using of grasses like the golden Hikana clover grass that we have here in front, just as a border. But just keeping them very simple lines, and it should follow the bed. You're not going to do more just random groupings, but create that line in the landscape, and that gives it that classic contemporary look. Maybe you're thinking you like more rustic, or maybe more of an English cottage kind of look. And again, the plant material you choose will help dictate that style. Usually for a rustic, you're looking at more of the old-fashioned ones, like your delphiniums, your Shasta daisies, your coneflowers, old-fashioned plants like red hot poker and liatris, and just doing more of random groupings. So depending on the size of your bed, you might be doing 3 of delphiniums because they grow larger, maybe a grouping of 5 ladies' mantle, a grouping of something else. So they're more random groupings that kind of grow in together to give that more natural look. But again, be adding in those accents into your garden that just conveys that theme. So whether it's a big old wagon wheel that you put in there, or some old tools or implements, maybe old gardening tools, an old bench, will help just convey that theme. But definitely the right choice of perennials in those areas will just help bring out that theme. We're often asked, well, how many plants should I include in a grouping? And that really depends on what size of bed area you're looking at. The larger the bed, the larger the grouping should be. Another factor is also how far are you looking at the bed? How far away are you when you look at it? If it's something in the far back corner of the yard, if you're doing 1 of this, 1 of that, it's not going to have that same effect if all you view that garden is from your patio 50, 60 feet away. So if you're viewing it from farther, you want to do larger groupings. If it's larger growing plants, something like the delphiniums, or there's bear's breeches that gets quite large, you can get away with doing less in that grouping. if it's smaller plants, to have the same balance. If you had like 3 huge hostas, if you just did 1 or 3 little ferns with it, the ferns will be lost in that combination. So it, again, depending on the size of your area, if you had 3 big hostas, you might have to do a group of 7 ferns to kind of balance that so the ferns aren't totally lost. If you've been gardening at all, you'll know that we always say to do odd numbers, and I'm not quite sure on the human logic of it, but I do know that if you put down 4, as soon as you add 1 or take 1 away, it always looks more balanced, and there's something about the odd numbers that just strikes the eye. It seems to make more sense in our minds for some reason. But if you're doing large mass groupings where you're doing 11 of something or 15 of something, you know, if you had 15 or 16, that's probably not going to show. But definitely does in the smaller numbers. So if you're doing a group of 3 hens and chicks, 2 on their own will probably look kind of off for some reason. You add the 3rd one there, and it will look more balanced to the eye. It's also a way that we have to sell more perennials. As we were saying, we always should start with a plan, and if you're planning a perennial garden, it is a great tool to sit down and draw it out. We've put on our website a landscape planning guide, and it's an ebook that you can download, and it will lead you through some of the questions to think about, but it also will show you how to kind of draw it out so that you can be thinking about where should I put color, where do I need summer interest, where do I need fall interest. And even just doing quick blobs on the paper will help you to think it through before you come to the garden centers. And it's just a great tool that we have to help you lead you through that process.